Hello, everyone. We are excited to be able to chat with you a little today about conflict management. So we are going to give our presentation titled, Why Can't We Be Friends? So the purpose of this workshop and why we're here today is because conflict is inevitable. And so we feel like it's really important for us to understand how we interpret and how we manage conflict with our peers and within our organizations. Through effective communication and positive conflict resolution, we can manage conflict. And this is something that we see come up with our student organizations and student leaders very often. So we want to give you some tools and resources to be able to manage conflict more effectively moving forward. So to give you some context for where we're going to go with this, we're first going to talk about conflict causes. So I think for some of you, it's probably pretty obvious what causes conflict because there are some things that come to your mind, but we're going to discuss how and why conflict occurs between your peers and with organizations, and maybe provide some more information on where some of your conflict could be stemming from. We're also going to talk about good conflict because we can reframe our mindset a little bit and see a positive outcome from some difficult situations. We're going to talk about healthy resolution and some themes of positive conflict resolution. And we're also going to do a quiz at the end where you can get to know your conflict style. So there's 5 different resolution styles, and it can help you to better understand how you perceive conflict and how you come off to others when you're handling conflict. So it's a fun little quiz we'll share with you at the very end. So we do want to just introduce ourselves real quick too. My name is Jessica Roshak. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Director for Student Leadership Development and Fraternity and Sorority Life.
And my name is Haley Corley. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm with the Graduate Assistant for Student Leadership Development. We are going to kick it off by starting with causes of conflict. So like Jessica said, many of us know what causes conflict, but we might not know the real stem or the root of what is really causing these problems in our relationships. There are 5 main types of conflict that we're going to cover today. And they are information conflict, values conflict, relationship conflict, and interest conflict, and structural conflicts. So to start with information conflict, this is where people may have conflicting information or not have all of the facts leading into a conflict. So think about if you have 2 very different news sources that are giving you information, you might have a conflict in information that's causing you to have a belief, and that could cause some conflict between you and a peer because you don't know all of the facts, or there could be competing types of information as well. The next one, values conflict, is pretty straightforward. Think about this as your values or your what is important to you is conflicting directly with an individual. This could be a perceived conflict or an actual conflict. But the tough thing about values conflicts are that values are very unchanging. We're not willing to compromise who we are. So these types of conflicts are less likely to receive compromise. They're more likely to be resolved in a way that we learn how to live together with our differences rather than change our values to accommodate for other people. The third one, relationship conflicts, really goes into that relationship, those stressors causing conflict within peer-to-peer relationships. So think about miscommunication, mistrust based on past experiences, those types of things that might cause you to look at another person and have a conflict or have a long-standing conflict based on a pattern of behaviors that you don't like in your relationship. The fourth one, interest conflict. This goes when people have competition or have competing resources that they need. This one we see more in like a job position where you might be maybe competing for a job, or your office only has so many resources and you have competing interests. So you're really looking to utilize those resources in the way that benefits your position, but you might have to make some compromise. And these ones are really good at being resolved through mediation because a lot of times that conflict and that competing resources or competing interests can be broken down and mediated and find that compromise in the middle. And then the last one, structural conflicts. This one's a little bit bigger than peer-to-peer. This is actually caused by systems. So even though individuals could be perpetuating a system or continuing to do actions that uphold that system of oppression, the core problem in this conflict is coming from the system itself or the structure of the environment that you're operating in rather than the person. So a lot of times we can get down and blame that person for that conflict without looking at the overall system that's causing that conflict. So those are the 5 types of conflict that we'll be looking at today. And to go back to those types, it's really important that we understand these conflict causes. So like Jessica said before, and like I've said, it's really easy for us to think we understand why conflict is occurring or look at a person and say we're having conflict because of X, Y, and Z. But when we really look at the root cause of that conflict or break it down to those 5 different types, it can be easier to develop that common ground between parties. So if we understand the root of the problem, outside of the relationship or outside of the individual, we can come to the table more willing to find that common ground. This also puts the conflict and centers it around the cause and not the person themselves. So it's looking at the factors that go into the conflict. And sometimes when we center the conflict around the person rather than the cause, it just can lead to more conflict. It can lead to more accusations and more feelings of mistrust. But this really centers the conflict around the facts and what's happening, rather than going back to that relationship. And the last one, this increases potential for avoiding future conflicts. So if you understand the core root of the problem, you can look out for it in the future. So you can really understand how that conflict is going to impact future relationships, future situations. So if I know I have a competing value, for example, from Jessica, I know to look out for that value as it comes up, or I know to avoid situations where our values would conflict because we've had this problem in the past and we've been able to sit down and talk about it. So that's just a small example of how this could increase potential for avoiding those future conflicts. And if we were in person, we would now take it to a pair and share, and you would be able to share out with a partner an example of conflict that you've experienced recently and what type of conflict it is. So I'll go ahead and give you an example. So my fiance, who I live with, just an example of conflict. We recently had a miscommunication based on like living space situations, which I know if you live with roommates, if you live in a dorm, in a residence hall, you could have some of these like relationship type conflicts. We had conflicts over like responsibilities in our house. And really boiling it down, that's a relationship conflict on miscommunication. So once we were able to identify, oh, we need to set expectations here and set those boundaries and who's going to be in charge of what, that conflict was easier to avoid in the future because we really understood that it wasn't the person who was causing the problem. It was the fact that we didn't communicate in that situation. So a very silly example, not end of the world in any means in terms of conflict, but it does demonstrate that if we can boil it down to that cause, it's easier for us to find a solution.
So we are going to talk a little bit about good conflict. So when we think of conflict, or at least when I do, you tend to think about the negative things because it's a frustrating situation. You can have some difficult conversations, but conflict can be good. And so we're going to watch a quick video where the speaker is going to tell us a little bit about some examples of how conflict can be good. And then we'll share out some examples afterward.
When I start to work with teams, many of them think that conflict is negative. We don't want to have conflict. The reality is conflict is not negative. As a matter of fact, it's an indication of something trying to happen. So instead of being passive or passive aggressive or being aggressive, you can look at how do you interact and how do you get curious about what's trying to happen in this relationship with this team. Let me give you an example of a company that I worked with recently. It was a leadership team, and they were doing fine. but they weren't achieving the results that they wanted to. And they were getting frustrated with each other, and there was some tension that was building. When we started to work together, we realized that there was some frustration with the different styles on the team. The CEO was visionary and creative and big picture, while the CFO was in the weeds, wanting to deal with all the details and the facts and the analysis. Can anybody relate to those differences? One of the senior vice presidents was all about process and making sure that all the voices on the team were heard. And he was getting frustrated with the other VP, who was all about results and outcomes. Now, as we started to work together, we explored their different styles and realized that high-performing teams have a mix of all of these styles. And indeed, that's exactly what can create some conflict. And so we work together to help them to understand each other's different primary style and to appreciate and build empathy for it. Because the highest performing teams have lots of different styles present. The result was they began to have healthy dialogue, positive conflict. Instead of holding back and letting things fester or blowing up, they stayed at the table and they had thoughtful, considerate conversations. And their ROI went up. They started to perform at the level that they were wanting to perform. Their connections improved. And they went from good to great.
So I think that video does a good job of providing context for, an example of how conflict can be good. I really like how she framed it in the beginning of conflict is something that's trying to happen. And so, if you were here, we'd have you share some examples, but we do want to highlight a few examples of how conflict can be good in our lives. When Haley and I were trying to think of this can be challenging because, again, it's really hard to reframe the idea of conflict to something that's positive. But when I was trying to think about some examples on campus, for example, we have a couple of different centers that came as a result of conflict. So we had a group of students that were really frustrated that they didn't have a space to call their own, or that they were not having their needs met. And it was, causing stress in their lives and not allowing them to be the excellent students that we know them to be. And so they got frustrated. There was some conflict between what the university was providing and what they needed and what they wanted. And so though that conflict was frustrating, what came as a result or that positive outcome were these centers that are able to provide those things. If you think about the new care center, that is something that came out of a little bit of conflict because we didn't have this and students saw the need. Now it's here and they're providing wonderful resources for students. So you can see that, it can be frustrating to get to that process, but conflict can have a positive outcome. On an individual level, I was trying to think of something that, worked for me. And when I started this job a few years ago, I encountered a little bit of conflict because I came into this job having loads of experience from other campuses. And so my lens of how I was looking at things was very critical, as opposed to the people that had been here and developed processes. They were really proud of the work that they had done. And I think that that is wonderful. And we did have some good things in place. So there was a little bit of conflict when I would ask questions about why we were doing these things, or I would provide some different ideas of how we could change processes or do things a little bit differently. And my colleagues and I didn't always see eye to eye on that. We had that internal conflict where we were talking about, well, I really feel passionately about this, but I feel passionately about this on another level. And so though that was tough to get through, we came to understand the why behind the things that we were doing. So why did we have this accreditation program? That's one thing that kind of comes to the forefront of my mind. What was the purpose of it? It led us, that conflict and disagreeing on a few things led us to having that really critical conversation of why are we doing this? And we came to a positive outcome where we're at a place now that we have a better process because because we got to the root of why we were doing these things. What were we asking of the students? And in my opinion, we made the process a little bit easier, but still got at that true root of why we were asking them to do this accreditation process and why we were celebrating the successes that they were doing. So again, we had a little bit of turmoil, a little bit of conflict to get to that point, but the outcome was really positive and something that we were proud of.
So now that we've talked about what could cause conflict and how we can change our mindset around conflict to better view conflict in a positive mindset, we're going to talk about how do we solve conflict? What are some resolution strategies that can really help you as a leader start to tackle those tough conversations? We're going to focus on 5 different conflict resolution strategies today. There's many out there, but when we boil it down, these are 5 that we find really important to student leadership overcoming those tough conversations. So the first one, self-awareness. Second one is communication. Third one is the goal of forgiveness. So having that overall goal of forgiveness, focusing on the present and having that relationship focus as well. So going back to self-awareness, this is really being aware of who you are, what you're feeling, and your emotions. So when I'm in a conflict, having a better self-awareness of my feelings and my emotions can lead me to being aware of how they influence my actions. So we all know when we're feeling things, it's really easy to not stop in the moment and take a second to reevaluate how that's causing your actions to appear. But having that awareness can really give you a second to pause, reflect on what you're feeling, allow you to feel those emotions, but not let it boil over into the conversation. It can also manage your stress levels. So it allows you to have a self-awareness of how can I remain calm in this situation, especially knowing maybe this is a high stress situation, high stakes conversation, but it gives you that self-awareness to realize how can I stay calm while handling this conflict. It also gives you awareness of those fundamental differences that we talked about earlier. So for example, values. If you have a self-awareness of what your values are, you'll be more likely to pinpoint those conversation pieces and less likely to contribute to that overall conflict. And then also this allows you to know your limits. So when we have conflict, it can be really easy to try to solve it right away. But we know that when we set boundaries and we set healthy boundaries that are good for us, it leads to a more positive outcome. So making sure we're ready to discuss the conflict before we even try or attempt to resolve it is really important. It gives you time to process, gives you the mental capacity to really discuss the conflict, and reduces some of that conflict that could occur just because we're not ready to have that conversation yet. Having a relationship focus is so important with conflict too. So when we have conflict, it can be really easy to blame the other person in the situation. But taking a step back and remembering the relationship is number one, and making that relationship the number one priority will actually allow us to strengthen or maintain our current relationships rather than potentially harm the relationship by having more conflict or really blaming the other person and damaging that relationship between you two. This also allows us to be respectful of differences that may arise. So when we're really focused on the person to person aspects of conflict rather than the conflict itself, we can be really respectful towards each other rather than maybe overstep or have situations in which we're disrespectful just because we're not focusing on the person instead of the conflict. And then the last piece of this relationship focus is to listen with the intent of learning more about their perspective. So when you do have a relationship focus and conflict, you are more likely to want to listen to the other person, to empathize, to find out, how did we get to this point? How did you get to this? How did you get to this conclusion or this outcome? And I want to know more about your perspective so we can either avoid conflict in the future or we can resolve it. When we look and see how that person is viewing the conflict and come to the table being willing to express how we got to this point as well, we can bridge that gap and bridge that difference. And this also goes along with communication. So I know many of you think, communication, miscommunication especially, leads to a lot of conflict in our lives, whether it be on campus, in student organizations. Miscommunication is probably one of the highest pieces for why we have conflict. So when you're communicating and when you're entering a conversation about a conflict, be aware of your verbal and nonverbal communication. Verbal, going back to that self-awareness, it can be really easy to have inflection in your voice, to have maybe raise your voice, have that tone that conveys that you're upset. But when you have that self-awareness and you're able to first reflect and understand how you're feeling, but then also communicate verbally in a way that's going to be respectful, it's easier to bridge that conflict. And then the other piece of this is your nonverbal communication. So while we a lot of times focus on our verbal communication or what we're saying in emails, text, etc., when you're face to face, that nonverbal communication can give away how you're feeling as well. So taking a second to relax, to calm down, to self-reflect, and then take the time to communicate effectively can really go a long way in these conversations. Another piece to this is you can set expectations at the beginning. If you know, for example, say I have a conflict with Jess and we're going to sit down and talk about it, I can enter that conversation saying, hey, we're having this conflict. I want to have this conversation, but this is what really I expect out of this conversation. If we're not able to do that right now, that's okay. We can revisit it later. But here are some of those expectations entering into the conversation. And here's what I'm bringing to the table as well. So setting those expectations ahead of time before you even start a conflict conversation can really help with the overall outcome. It also lets the other person know your boundaries. And it overall leads to both parties feeling heard. If both parties can say what they expect out of the conversation, and hopefully those things are upheld, then you'll be more likely to overcome that conflict. And then you're allowed to express your feelings in words. By no means is this saying, don't express your feelings. We want you to be able to enter conflict conversations and tell the other person how you're feeling open and honestly, but try to eliminate actions that may express your feelings. So for example, if somebody's upset, instead of telling the other person they're upset, sometimes actions could be a result of spite. So you could go and do something that perpetuates that conflict rather than sitting down and talking about it first. And that's really what we hope that students will avoid, is having that open and honest conversation first is important, but avoiding those conflicts that come out of spite and spiteful actions. And then the last one, avoid personal attacks. So really try to focus again at that root core of the problem rather than attacking the person verbally, hopefully not physically, but yeah, really taking that time to sit down and avoid attacking that person or their character. The next one is to focus on the present. So this one can be really hard in conflict, especially if you have multiple conflicts with the same person. But we suggest that you avoid stockpiling. So stockpiling is when you have a conflict with somebody in the moment. Maybe you let it go, and then the next conflict comes up and it stacks and it continues to pile up until you cannot take it anymore. And then you have, instead of one conflict to talk about, you might have 7. Or this whole pile of things that have gone wrong in this conversation. So we really hope that after today, you feel empowered to go and have those conversations, those critical conversations about conflict, and that you avoid stockpiling in the future so that your conflict is resolved quicker and easier, and you have those positive interactions. And then the last piece of this is to not bring up solved conflict. So if you've had conflict in the past and it's been resolved, you've reached a conclusion, it can be easy the next time you have conflict with the same person to reflect on that situation and think about what went wrong in that situation as well. So if you've solved something and it's in the past, the best piece of advice we have to give you is to focus on the present. Focus on what's going on in the moment. Take your time, utilize the other tips, like assess the situation, but don't bring up those solved pieces of conflict because they can lead to more negative feelings that really can damage that relationship. And then our last piece is to be open to forgiveness. So I put a quote in here, and it states, resolution lies in releasing the urge to punish, which can never compensate for our losses and only adds to our injury by further depleting and draining our lives. So I liked this when searching for conflict resolution tips, because resolution really does lie in resisting that urge to, get something out of the situation or to get a one up on somebody. That can never fix what happened. Just like, getting revenge can never fix the situation that occurred. You can never go back and change that situation that caused you to feel those feelings. So we really suggest that you take a look at what's going on in the situation and really be open to forgiveness before you even enter a conversation. If you're not open to forgiveness and you enter a conversation about conflict, there's not going to be a resolution. There's not going to be a chance for either party to move on from the situation. And all it does is further deplete and drain your life. So it can really suck that positivity out of the relationship, out of the situation. And we would love for our students to avoid that. We would love for our students to come to the table ready to reach a compromise, ready to reach an agreement, and be open to that forgiveness piece as well. Knowing when to move on. So this piece can be really hard, but sometimes you have to move on from a situation. You might not reach the conclusion that you want. You might not reach that end piece that you were looking for, but know when it's time to move on, when it's good for you, when it will be healthy for you to let things go. And then lastly, compromise if possible. So it's always best if both parties can walk away from the conversation feeling like they achieved compromise, but that's not always possible. And we understand that. But if we can, and if we can be open to forgiveness, we might be able to compromise a little bit better in the future.
So we're going to talk a little bit about knowing your conflict style. As Haley was talking through some of the healthy resolutions, I know that for me, some of those were spot on, that I do the opposite of what I should. So I know I'm a stockpiler. I know it. And yeah, I'm trying really hard to break myself of that. But I'm sure that as she was talking through those, you could think through, yeah, this is something that I struggle with, or here's something that I do really well. And so we're going to do a little activity that will help you to understand your conflict management style. So we do have a conflict management style assessment, which of course we can't do with you here, but we will put a link to it in the caption of this video. It's about conflict animals, and we'll talk a little bit about those here in a few slides, but we would strongly encourage you to go through. It only takes a couple minutes to figure out what your style is, and then it'll help you to really understand where you're coming from. So the benefits of knowing your style, we are asking you to do something extra. We'll give it to you as a little bit of homework after this presentation. So we do want to tell you why this is important. And we've touched on this a little bit already. But first and foremost, it's going to help you to take actions of others less personally. When you can understand how you're interpreting conflict, it helps you to internalize, why am I getting upset at this? Why am I taking this personally? But it also helps you to understand what their conflict style is. And so if Haley is somebody that's really competitive, and so she's being more direct and she's coming at me in what I feel is a personal attack, maybe it's not a personal attack. It's just how she manages conflict. And if I'm aware of these different styles, I'm going to take it less personally, hopefully, and be able to understand she's not mad at me. This is just how she handles her conflict. Another benefit is consciously choosing a different style when situations demand it. So you are going to work with so many different people within your student organization and within life in general. And so being able to consciously choose different styles of leadership or choose those different styles of conflict management can help you to maintain your relationships. So if you are a student organization president, for example, and you know that you're working with somebody that is a little more sensitive, a little more empathetic, you can come to them instead of maybe being a competitive person and trying to win that argument, even if that's your natural conflict management style, saying, okay, I know that this person is not going to interpret this well. They're going to take this personally. So I can take a step back and say, okay, let me think about the other conflict management styles and see if I can tune in a little bit to some of those. By consciously choosing that different style, it helps you to maintain that relationship and understand how you're coming off and approaching that individual. Another thing is different styles lead to different approaches. And so understanding, again, where people are coming from, it'll help you to manage your executive board. It'll help you to manage your team in general or your student organization. And so being able to take those different styles to gain those different results, to work with different people, it will really help to build that consensus and build that harmony amongst the group. It'll stop thinking in terms of I'm right and they're wrong. And if we take anything away from this presentation, we hope that you remember this, is that conflict is supposed to be purposeful. It's something trying to happen, going back to that video. It shouldn't be an argument that you're just trying to win or you're trying to prove somebody wrong. I know it's really easy to fall in that trap. I'm not going to say that I'm perfect at this and that I never try and win the argument, because I do. It just kind of comes naturally to us. But we have to stop seeing all conflict in terms of that kind of black and white, that right and wrong. We want to make sure that there is a reason that we're seeking a resolution, especially in your student organizations and in your teams, because we want to be sure that we have some sort of positive outcome and we can continue to move forward instead of dwelling within that conflict. And then finally, each of us is capable of using all 5 conflict handling modes. And so when you take the quiz, you'll get a specific thing that you lean towards. That is not to completely define you. You are able to kind of hop between these different conflict management styles. There's just some that come more naturally to you than others. And so going back to that idea of consciously choosing different styles when situations demand it, take a minute and think about what you could pull from each of these styles as we go through them in the next slide to see how can you be the most effective person when it comes to conflict management. There is no right or wrong conflict management style, as situations require different things, different people require different things and approaches. And so please know that no matter what you get when you take this quiz, there's nothing that's better than the other. It just completely is situational. So the style breakdown. So we mentioned when you take this conflict animal style quiz, it will give you one of these 5 styles. And so we'll go through a little bit what these may be. And when you take the quiz, it'll give you some context too. But we have these 5. The first is the owl, and they focus on collaboration. They highly value goals and relationships. They try to begin a discussion that identifies that conflict is a problem and strive to resolve tensions and maintain the relationship by seeking solutions that satisfy both themselves and the other person. So the owl is somebody that's trying to see both sides of the situation and come to some sort of compromise. This is my preferred style. This is what I kind of lean towards. It's the collaborating owl. I want everybody to end the conflict or the situation at least feeling valued. Maybe we won't agree, but we at least feel heard and we feel valued. And that's something that the owl really focuses on. Kind of on the flip side of that, we have the shark. This is somebody that's very competitive. They value their goals over relationships, meaning that if forced to choose, they would seek to achieve their goals, even at the cost of the relationship involved, more concerned with accomplishing their goals than with being liked by others. This one can sound a little harsh. And so I want to put a little bit of a positive spin on this for those of you that may lean towards this style. Competition is not bad, and achieving your goals is not bad. The competitive shark sometimes sees the goals as more important than the people, and that can be challenging. And I think that's where a lot of frustration comes from for team members or organization members. However, we need sharks in our corner. We need people that want those results and that are going to do everything that they can to get us to our end goal. That helps us to move forward. So I know it sounds a little harsh, but if this is your style, it's not bad. We need you to be able to help us to produce those results when the collaborating owls like me just want everybody to feel good. We can't always have one or the other. We need to work together so that we can supplement what our strengths and weaknesses are. The fox, this is someone that compromises. They're moderately concerned with both their goals and their relationships with others, seek a compromise. They give up part of their goals and persuade the other person in a conflict to give up part of their goals. So I see the fox is kind of the in between the owl and the shark. They're somebody that they understand that we need to get somewhere in the end. And so not everybody's going to be happy, but if we can come together, we can have that conversation, we can find some sort of compromise. These are your people that are really good with the negotiating and kind of coming to the table with seeing this view, but also being able to see someone else's. Bless you, Haley. We have the avoiding turtle. So this is probably one that we see in our student body more than anything, is that we avoid confrontation at all costs. They value avoiding confrontation more than either goals or relationships. They often find it easier to withdraw from a conflict than to face it. So, we kind of go into our shell and avoid everything else. This is the easiest by far because we can just kind of sit back and ignore the conflict. But inevitably what happens is if we keep avoiding conflict, then it just piles on and piles on until we're really not sure what to do. So if you're an avoiding turtle, definitely to pay attention to some of these healthy resolutions that we talked about earlier, because we have to confront conflict in some way. We can't just let something fester. We have to move forward in some capacity, but our turtles, they want to avoid it as much as they can because it's uncomfortable. And then finally, we have the accommodating teddy bear. So these people typically value relationships over their own goals. If they're forced to choose, they're going to sacrifice their goals in order to maintain relationships. They try to smooth over conflict to prevent damage to the relationship. So these are your people pleasers. These are the people that say, okay, I don't care what I was doing. It's okay. Let me help you. That's okay. Don't worry about my opinion. I value yours. And that's wonderful. These are the people that make you feel really good because you can tell they're invested in you and they give up anything that is their personal goals or something they're invested in order to make you happy. That's great. And it feels warm and fuzzy, which is why they're the teddy bears, but it doesn't necessarily always give us the greatest results because you as a person are important. And even though we want to please other people and we want to maintain those relationships, you have to make sure that your opinion is heard and that you're a part of the conversation and a part of that resolution. So what we would hope to do is if you are here with us today, we would gather with you that share the same conflict style as you. And so you could tell us about a time a conflict worked really well and a time that your conflict style caused your team frustration. So thinking about me being the collaborating owl, the time that my conflict style works really well is when we're in big groups. So in my role, I work with fraternities and sororities. And so we have a lot of times where there's a lot of opinions in the room. And so I want to come together to be able to say, okay, let's hear everybody's opinion. So that's when it works really well for me, is when I'm in charge of a team or I'm in charge of a group or I'm working with a fraternity or a sorority when we have anywhere from 5 to 100 people that all have some sort of input for a given situation. My strength is I'm able to have those opinions be heard without feeling a little convoluted and like we're not getting anywhere. I want to hear everything before we make an informed decision moving forward. And that tends to work really well for me in the job that I'm in. When it causes me frustration, though, I think is in the other side of my job. So I work in leadership development and, we like to bring in campus partners. We want to bring people in, we partner with student organizations, and that's really great and wonderful. And it makes me feel good to be able to collaborate. But sometimes it can be really frustrating because when people aren't upholding their end of the bargain, or when I want to have so many people involved in this because I value their input, it can be overwhelming. And when those opinions don't necessarily align with a program. So say we have 5 campus partners and we have 5 different opinions in the room as to how we need to move forward with a program or an event, that can cause conflict. And that makes me kind of want to avoid a little bit because I want to collaborate. I want their opinions, but sometimes it's really hard for me to move forward when those opinions don't align well. So for the collaborating owls, maybe you'll be able to relate to some of those, but I would encourage you that when you find out what your conflict style is, to reflect on these things. Think about a time when it worked really well for you and think about where it can cause you some frustration. Being able to have that self-awareness and that personal reflection will help you to figure out moving forward, how can you use maybe one of the other styles, pull some of those things in, or where can you work in areas that you can grow so that conflict resolution isn't as scary for you. So what now? You have all this information. What do we hope that you do from this point on? We hope that you know that conflict is hard and no one ever handles it perfectly. I mentioned this before, but I'm a stockpiler. I know that that is my imperfection. And so I have to keep in mind that I'm not going to be perfect when I handle every conflict. But if I can be aware of myself and I know what my strengths and weaknesses are, it can help me to do it a little bit better every single time. Addressing conflict is uncomfortable, but it's best to address the situation. We talked about this with our avoiding turtles. We hope that you can address conflict in some way, whether it's a big conflict, small conflict, whatever it may be. Just kind of dip your toe in, figure out how you can be a little bit more comfortable with the uncomfortableness of conflict to be able to address situations and move forward so that you can continue to make progress in your student organization or group. We also hope that it helps you to understand your styles and consider the style of others. So going back to that idea of some situations and some people require different things or prefer different methods of communication or conflict management. So by understanding yourself, you can more effectively maintain those relationships and hopefully address conflict a little bit better every time. We also hope that you practice. So we've given you some tools. Go out in the world and practice these skills. Reflect afterward to say, okay, what about that situation went really well and what could I have done better? Then come back and think about, okay, if I could have done this better, what sort of resolution style could I have pulled in, or where can I seek help? And that's our last point, is ask for help when you need it. Conflict is not something that we hope that you go on your merry way and have to handle yourself all the time. You're capable. I want you to know you're capable of doing that, but ask for help. You being at this presentation is already step one in kind of figuring out what can you do better. Come and see us, shoot us an email, rely on your other organization members that maybe have a different conflict management style than you for help and advice, because you're not in this alone. So we hope that you take some of these things away, and where Haley's going to touch on a few other events that we have coming up where you can continue to practice these skills as well as develop others.
So like Jess said, we do have a few upcoming programs in the Leadership Center at which you could really practice these skills. The first one is the Leadership Challenge. So this is a new program. It's occurring this Thursday at 5 p.m. And we're partnering with Student Success Programs to launch this program today. And what it is it's a space where students can come together and in teams of 4 to 6 people, or you can come by yourself and we'll make a team as well. And you can really test your communication, problem solving, and collaboration through a minute-to-minute style leadership activity. So in these situations, they are on a time crunch. A little bit of conflict may occur, harmless conflict, but we hope that you come and test those leadership skills with your team or as an individual. The next one is our Kent Talks. So Kent Talks is our signature program that really is a forum for Kent State students to come together, learn about difference in experiences and in viewpoints on a specific topic. So we're talking about race in America, and this one will be on September 20th at 6 p.m. And here we're going to really cover skills to have those difficult conversations in which you may not align with the person 100%, but we will give you those skills that can also be used in conflict management. And then we also have our lessons in leadership. So we're hearing from both Erica Schoaf and Sydney Jordan at our next lessons in leadership. And this is an interview style event on Instagram Live where these people will talk about their experiences, their leadership advice, and advice for students in general. But it's also a forum for you to ask them questions about their personal experiences. So if you don't know, both of these individuals work in the Care Center. So Erica works as the Assistant Dean of Students and Director of Student Support or Student Advocacy and Support. And then Sydney is the Assistant Director for the Care Center. So both two very influential people on campus right now as the Care Center is just launched. If you would like to learn more about their experiences, please join us or hop onto our Instagram in the days that follow and watch the recording because it will be there as well. And then if you'd like to stay up to date on our events and workshops, please scan our QR code. There you can sign up, and we do publicize all of our events as well as events on campus and even some leadership workshops and conferences that are occurring off campus that you might want to take advantage of. And then lastly, we do want to hear from you. So take a few minutes, 2 to 3, and complete this short assessment for us. This really gives us your student voice and what workshops you want to see. What do you want to hear from us? And how did you enjoy this program? So give us some tips on how we can improve. We'd love to hear from you. And we really do take your student input into consideration. And then lastly, thank you. If you ever have any questions or you just need leadership support, feel free to reach out to lead@kent.edu. That's our email. We also have our phone number on here and our Instagram and Twitter handle. So if you want to stay up to date on our events, and social media is the best way to reach you, we do post all of our events there as well. And we welcome you to come into the Leadership Center, reach out to us. We really do enjoy interacting with you and giving you leadership advice and connecting you to resources on campus as well. Thanks, everyone.